He lived 30 years with a secret. He watched the seasons change. He watched neighbors move away. He watched headlines fade into archive pages. He built a normal life.
April 1st, 1988. Good Friday in Fort Wayne. The kind of spring morning that feels ordinary in every possible way. The air was cool but bright. Lawns were waking up from winter. Children were outside because school was closed for the holiday. 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley stepped out of her house just before noon. She told her family she was going to a friend's home. Somewhere along that short walk, she encountered the man who would take her life. Investigators later concluded she was likely abducted quickly. There were no confirmed reports of screaming, no prolonged public struggle. Whatever happened, it happened fast. By late afternoon, April had not returned home. At first, it was concern, the kind that fades when a child shows up late and apologetic. But as the hours passed, unease settled in. 1988. Good Friday in Fort Wayne. It was the kind of Midwestern morning that felt unremarkable in the best possible way. A thin layer of cool air lingered from winter, but sunlight cut through it cleanly. Lawns were beginning to green again. The neighborhood.
It was a simple errand. Brief, ordinary, temporary. She expected to come back. Her family expected her to come back. There was no argument that morning, no tension, no disruption in routine. The normalcy of that day would later become one of the most painful parts of the story. She walked into a neighborhood she knew. Child abduction homicides that occur in daylight within residential neighborhoods often involved one of two dynamics: an authority ruse, your mom asked me to, rapid physical control combined with immediate vehicle access. The absence of chaos suggests control, and control suggests preparation. By late afternoon, April had not returned. At first, her absence was an inconvenience, a delay, a child losing track of time. But as the sun lowered, something shifted. Concern became urgency. Her family began searching the streets. They retraced her path. In the early stages of a child abduction case, investigators consider whether the crime was opportunistic or targeted. Opportunistic offenders act when chance presents itself. Targeted offenders observe, study, and anticipate. April was taken in daylight, in a residential setting, within a short walking radius of her home. This suggests proximity. As darkness settled, Fort Wayne felt different. Parents kept children indoors. Porch lights remained on. Conversations turned uneasy. The disappearance of a child fractures a community's sense of order. It introduces uncertainty into what had been stable. Inside the Tinsley home, the waiting began. Waiting is a psychological strain few families are prepared for. Every passing minute magnifies possibility. 3 days after her disappearance, a man jogging along a rural road near Spencerville, just outside Fort Wayne, noticed something in a narrow drainage ditch. He slowed down. He looked closer. It was a small body. April had been discarded miles from her home. The distance matters. Offenders frequently transport victims away from the abduction site to reduce immediate detection. Dump sites are often selected within areas the offender. This was not panic. This was intentional. Near the scene, investigators recovered one of her shoes. Additional items were found inside a shopping bag. Every piece of evidence was cataloged carefully. In 1988, DNA testing existed, but it was limited and slow. There was no national genetic genealogy database. CODIS was not yet the expansive tool it would become. Investigators preserved by. In many long-term unsolved cases, there is a period where the offender believes he has succeeded. He watches media coverage fade. He observes public fear subside. He notices detectives move on to newer cases. Psychologically, that period can create over. For 2 years, silence. Not complete silence. There were tips, suspects, interviews, polygraphs, and the endless paper trail that follows a child homicide investigation. But there was no breakthrough, no arrest, no confession, no forensic match. In cases like this, time becomes a psychological battlefield. Families endure. In April of 1990, Almost exactly 2 years after the murder of April Marie Tinsley, a farmer in a rural area near Fort Wayne noticed something unusual on the side of a barn. Written in what appeared to be red crayon were words that stopped investigators cold. The message referenced April by name. It included sexually explicit language. It suggested knowledge that only the killer would have. The tone was taunting. This was no random vandal. This was personal. Law enforcement immediately recognized the shift in behavioral dynamics. Then came more. Additional barn markings appeared in surrounding rural areas. Similar tone, similar color, similar references. And then something even more disturbing. In 1990, a letter was mailed to the Tinsley family home. Inside was a photograph of a young girl, not April, taken in secret from a distance. The letter included a message threatening that the girl pictured would be the next victim if the writer was not caught. The psychological implications were chilling. This was not merely reliving the past. This was fantasy rehearsal. Threat letters serve multiple purposes for offenders of this profile. Control extension, the offender reasserts dominance over the victim's family. Public relevance, the offender ensures the crime. Based on crime scene evidence and subsequent communications, investigators developed a working profile. Male, likely white, familiar with the Fort Wayne region, comfortable navigating rural roads, organized and methodical, socially functional but emotionally deviant, possible history of voyeurism or peeping behavior, likely employed. The original abduction had been clean. No witnesses came forward. When news of the barn messages broke, fear resurfaced across Allen County. Parents once again restricted children's movements, schools reviewed safety procedures, media coverage intensified. The unknown predator had resurfaced, and he was close enough to drive into rural areas and right on barns without being seen. Geographic profiling became a major. Despite the renewed attention, no arrest followed. The messages stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The letter writer vanished again into anonymity. From 1990 forward, the case entered what investigators call a cold but active status. Evidence was maintained, tips were logged, periodic reviews occurred. But without new forensic capabilities, there was no direct path to identification. For the Tinsley family, the psychological toll compounded. Not only had they lost their daughter, they had been forced to endure the killer's reappearance, his threats, his cruelty. In many unsolved homicide cases, families describe a unique pain. The offender is alive, aging, living freely. The evidence collected in 1988 and 1990 remained preserved. Biological samples, the envelope, the stamp, the genetic material extracted from the crime scene. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, forensic science advanced significantly. Short tandem repeat, STR, DNA analysis became standardized. National databases like CODIS expanded. But in this case, no direct match appeared in CODIS. That implies something specific. The offender had likely never been convicted of a felony requiring DNA submission. He was not in the system. That meant traditional database match. For nearly 30 years, the evidence sat in storage, sealed, cataloged, preserved. Inside envelopes and sterile containers were microscopic fragments of biological material collected in 1988 and again in 1990. Trace evidence that investigators believed belonged to the killer of April Marie Tinsley. In the late 1980s, DNA analysis was in its infancy. By the 1990s, it had become a credible forensic tool. By the 2000s, it was standardized. But there was a limitation. Traditional forensic DNA matching depends on direct comparison, either to a suspect's known sample. In April 2018, law enforcement in California announced the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the man accused of being the Golden State Killer. The method used to identify him marked a turning point in criminal investigations, genetic genealogy. Instead of searching criminal databases, investigators uploaded crime scene DNA in a legally permissible and anonymized format into a public genealogy database where individuals voluntarily share genetic information to explore family ancestry. The biological sample collected from the crime scene was prepared for genealogical analysis. Unlike CODIS, which uses specific forensic markers, genealogy databases analyze broader single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, which allow for distant relative matching. The DNA was uploaded into a public genealogy platform. Then came the waiting. Within weeks, potential relative matches appeared. Not close matches, not siblings or children, distant cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins. From there, forensic genealogists began the meticulous process of constructing ancestral trees. This is slow, detail-oriented. Investigators do not arrest based solely on genealogical inference. They confirm. In July 2018, surveillance teams began monitoring Miller. He was 59 years old. He lived in Grabille, Indiana, a small community northeast of Fort Wayne. He worked, he maintained a home, he appeared outwardly unremarkable. Neighbors would later describe him as quiet, ordinary, the word that appears again and again in cases like this, ordinary. But investigators needed a direct DNA sample to confirm. Once in custody, Miller was advised of his rights. Interrogations in cases of this magnitude often follow a structured progression. Establish baseline conversation, introduce evidence incrementally, observe psychological shifts, present the irrefutable forensic match. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Miller With a suspect identified, behavioral analysts could now compare profile to reality. Miller had lived within proximity of the crime scene in 1988. He had familiarity with the area. He had access to a vehicle. He had no felony convictions that placed him in CODIS. The organized aspects of the crime aligned with his ability to maintain long-term employment and avoid detection. The letters suggested lingering deviant fantasy rather than impulsive violence. Importantly, when news broke in 2018 that an arrest had been made in the murder of April Tinsley, the reaction in Fort Wayne was immediate. Shock, relief, grief resurfacing. For many residents, the case had been a formative childhood memory. Parents who had once restricted their children in 1988 were now grandparents. The name April Tinsley had never fully disappeared from local consciousness. Now, there was When a case remains unsolved for 30 years, the eventual arrest doesn't just close a file, it allows reconstruction. With the identity of John D. Riller confirmed through DNA and confession, investigators could re-examine the crime not as a mystery, but as a completed psychological sequence. Sexual homicide involving a child is rarely impulsive in the psychological sense. It may appear sudden in execution, but the underlying fantasy often predates the act by months or years. Offenders who target children typically exhibit persistent deviant sexual ideation, voyeuristic behavior, boundary testing, lingering, watching, approaching, escalating rehearsal fantasies. There is no public evidence that Miller had prior convictions for child-related crimes. That does not mean absence of behavior. Many sexual offenders operate in a pre-crime space for years, engaging in fantasy, pornography. Strangulation was the method of killing. Strangulation is intimate. It requires sustained physical force and proximity. It also allows the offender to maintain visual contact with the victim during the act. Psychologically, that dynamic reflects dominance reinforcement. Unlike impulsive weapons-based homicides, manual strangulation often indicates desire for direct control, anger or sexualized aggression, need for prolonged interaction. 2 years passed before the Barn messages appeared. That gap is psychologically significant. Many offenders experience post-offense stabilization. After committing a violent act, the immediate anxiety and hypervigilance gradually decline. But fantasy does not disappear. Instead, it recycles. The red crayon messages referencing April's name were not spontaneous vandalism. They were ego reinforcement. Communication after a crime reflects one of 3 motivations: reclaiming power, re-experiencing the act, testing law enforcement competence. The fact that Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this case is not the crime itself, but the decades afterward. From 1988 to 2018, Miller lived freely. He aged, he worked, he interacted socially. He did not appear in CODIS. He was not identified through traditional suspect pools. This raises a difficult but necessary point in forensic psychology. Some offenders commit a single catastrophic act and never repeat.
Geographic profiling played an understated but critical role in this case. The abduction site, body recovery site, and barn message locations formed a behavioral map. Criminologists refer to this as journey to crime analysis. Offenders typically operate within a predictable spatial pattern. Too close to home increases risk of recognition. Too far reduces.
By 2018, forensic genealogy had matured. Investigators uploaded the crime scene DNA into public genealogy databases and constructed family trees through distant cousin matches. Without this technique, the case may have remained unsolved indefinitely. When law enforcement collected discarded DNA from Miller in Grabille, Indiana, and confirmed the match, the psychological advantage he had maintained. When confronted with the DNA match, Miller confessed. Confessions after forensic confrontation often follow a specific pattern: initial minimization, gradual admission, acceptance once denial is futile. There was no elaborate alternative narrative, no long courtroom defense. The arrest of John D. Miller in 2018 closed a 30-year gap in justice for the murder of April Marie Tinsley, but it also opened a window into the evolution of forensic science and the psychology of long-term offenders. This case illustrates how human persistence, combined with technological innovation, can overcome decades of uncertainty. It is a testament to the fact that even in the absence of immediate evidence, patterns, whether behavioral, spatial, or genetic, can eventually lead to resolution. For decades, investigators relied on standard techniques: witness interviews, tip lines, handwriting analysis, and crime scene evidence. Yet these methods failed to identify Miller. The breakthrough came through genetic genealogy, a method that was barely conceivable in 1988. By comparing crime scene DNA to profiles voluntarily uploaded to ancestry databases, investigators could link distant relatives, reconstruct family trees, and eventually isolate a viable suspect. This approach has fundamentally changed cold case investigations in the United States. For the Fort Wayne community, April's murder was more than a singular tragedy. It was a trauma that persisted for generations. Parents adjusted routines, children were monitored more closely, and awareness of stranger danger intensified. The psychological footprint of such crimes extends far beyond the immediate victim. Communities internalize fear and loss, often creating lasting behavioral changes. When Miller was finally apprehended, relief mixed with grief. The community gained closure, but the psychological scars endured. Many residents described a sense of delayed justice. The emotional burden had been decades in the making. Miller's guilty plea in 2019 led to a combined 80-year prison sentence, 50 years for murder and 30 years for sexual assault of a child. The case never required a lengthy trial because the forensic evidence was irrefutable. He later died in prison in September. From a forensic psychology perspective, the April Tinsley case represents an intersection of organized predation and delayed justice. Miller's ability to evade detection for decades demonstrates that some offenders are highly adaptive, capable of compartmentalizing criminal behavior while maintaining conventional lives. Yet, despite decades of freedom, the fundamental truth remains: deviant acts leave traces, physical, psychological, and, eventually, genetic. The evolution of investigative techniques ensures that those traces are no longer hidden indefinitely. Science catches up with human behavior. Patterns emerge. Justice is attainable. The murder of April Marie Tinsley was a profound tragedy. Her life was cut short, her community traumatized.